The police were called because a 68-year-old woman had seemingly vanished from her own home. For nearly 2 weeks, Monique Gilbertson had been completely unreachable. Her car was still sitting outside, her dogs were still inside, and the people who knew her best were starting to fear that something terrible had happened. But when officers finally arrived at her home in Las Vegas, they didn't find Monique. They found a man who wasn't supposed to be there. His name was Daniel Rue, also known as Jacine, and almost immediately, Daniel had an explanation. He claimed Monique had left town and asked him to watch the house while she was away. On the surface, it sounded like a reasonable explanation, until officers started asking simple questions. Where had she gone? When was she coming back? And most importantly, why was her car still sitting in the driveway? Daniel insisted that Monique really left, but the officers weren't convinced. Something about the situation didn't make sense, and they were about to discover that Daniel's presence inside the house was only the beginning of what was wrong, because the woman they had come to check on was nowhere to be found, and the person claiming to know exactly where she was couldn't give police a straight answer. To understand why officers were at that house in the first place, we have to go back to the call that brought them there. It was November 6th in Las Vegas when an employee at a 55 and over community became concerned about one of its residents. That resident was Monique Gilbertson. The front office hadn't heard from her since October 22nd. At first, they tried knocking on her door. No one answered, but there was something they couldn't ignore. Her dogs were still inside, and they were behaving strangely. According to the employee, the dogs were going crazy, something they wouldn't normally do if Monique was okay. Then the employee tried calling her. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second time, someone answered, but there was no conversation. The employee kept saying hello, trying to get a response. Nothing. Then the caller hung up. That was when concern turned into something much more serious. Monique wasn't simply unreachable. She had disappeared without leaving the normal signs that she had actually gone anywhere. Her car was still at the residence, her dogs were there, and the front office, which was normally in regular contact with her, hadn't heard from her in nearly 2 weeks. There was another detail that made the situation even more concerning. Monique had previously contacted police over a problem involving a roommate. During that situation, she had reportedly discovered a gun among his belongings. Now, weeks later, she had suddenly gone silent. So the employee made the decision to call 911 and request a welfare check. Within minutes, officers were on their way. They believed they were responding to a woman who might be in danger. What they didn't know was that when they reached her front door, someone else would answer, and that man's explanation for being inside would immediately raise the first major red flag of the investigation. When officers reached the house, Daniel Rue was already inside. He immediately tried to explain why. According to Daniel, Monique had left town for a bit, and he was simply staying behind to look after the property. But there was a problem. Nobody at the community's front office knew Daniel was supposed to be there, and Monique's car was still sitting outside. Officers began asking Daniel about his relationship with Monique and how he had ended up inside her home. His explanation quickly became complicated. At one point, Daniel described himself as someone who rented the property. Then his explanation shifted. Now he was only house-sitting. It was a small change in his story, but to the officers, it was enough to raise suspicion. They asked him to step outside so they could continue their investigation. Daniel refused. Instead, he repeatedly insisted that he had legal rights to remain inside and claimed he had paperwork proving he was supposed to be there. But the officers weren't interested in arguing over paperwork. They were trying to find a missing woman, and Daniel couldn't give them a convincing explanation for where she was. He claimed Monique had gone to the East Coast because of an emergency involving her brother, but when officers pressed him for details, his answers became increasingly vague. He couldn't clearly explain where her brother lived. He couldn't give them a reliable way to contact Monique. And then there was the issue with her phone. Daniel claimed that Monique had lost her phone and temporarily paused the service. He said she had contacted him using a friend's phone. But according to Daniel, he hadn't actually spoken with her in several days. That didn't match what police had already learned. The front office had told them that Monique was normally in regular contact with them. In fact, they said she could be in contact with the office several times a day, yet no one had heard from her since October 22nd. Her car hadn't moved, her dogs were still inside, and now there was a man inside her home whose presence nobody could confirm. The inconsistencies were starting to pile up, but Daniel wasn't finished explaining himself. He insisted that Monique had told people he was staying there. He claimed she had asked him to house sit because she suddenly needed to travel east to deal with an emergency. The officers checked with the people who should have known about the arrangement: the front office, security, the HOA. None of them had any record of Daniel living there. As far as they were concerned, Monique was the only person who was supposed to be staying in that residence, and that made one question even harder to ignore. If Daniel really had nothing to hide, why was he fighting so hard to keep police outside? The officers continued pressing him. Eventually, they learned that Daniel wasn't some random stranger who had appeared in Monique's house. He actually knew her. The two had met several months earlier at Home Depot. Monique had eventually allowed Daniel to stay with her in exchange for helping around the house, but the arrangement had started to fall apart. Arguments developed over cleanliness. There were also accusations that Daniel and his wife, Gina Lopez, had been stealing from Monique, and eventually, Monique wanted the couple out. That detail suddenly changed the way officers looked at Daniel's presence inside the home, because if Monique had really been trying to get Daniel and Gina to leave, why were they still there? And if Monique had really left town voluntarily, why had she left behind her car, her dogs, and a house full of people who apparently weren't supposed to be there? Officers now had enough questions, but they still didn't have the one answer they needed most. Where was Monique? And the only way to find out was to get inside the house. By this point, the officers had heard enough. Daniel's explanation had changed. Nobody at the community could confirm that he was supposed to be living there. Monique was still missing, and Daniel seemed determined to keep police from entering the house. So officers gave him a simple choice: step outside and let them check the residence.
They repeatedly explained that they weren't there to search through his personal belongings. They only wanted to check the areas where a person could reasonably be. But Daniel continued to hesitate. He wanted to speak with his wife first. He worried about what police might do once they entered. He even questioned whether they might change something inside the house and later blame him for it. To the officers, his behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious. They kept reassuring him that they weren't trying to arrest him.
They simply needed to confirm one thing: where was Monique?
Eventually, Daniel agreed to step outside. His wife, Gina Lopez, came outside as well, and for the first time since arriving, officers were able to enter the residence without Daniel standing between them and the search. What they saw inside immediately made the situation feel much worse. The house was filthy. Animal feces covered parts of the floor. Drug paraphernalia was scattered throughout the rooms. There were piles of clutter everywhere, making it difficult to see certain areas clearly. And there was a strange odor hanging in the air. Officers began moving through the residence, checking the places where Monique could possibly be, but she wasn't there, at least not anywhere they could immediately see. The longer they searched, the more confusing the situation became. Daniel had insisted that Monique was gone, yet there was still no clear evidence that she had actually left. Her car was outside, her dogs were inside, and the house itself looked nothing like the home of someone who had simply left town for an emergency. Officers continued searching. Then, one of them noticed something unusual: a large chest freezer. It wasn't just another piece of furniture. The freezer was locked. The officers examined it more closely. There was a key involved, and they began trying to figure out how the lock worked. At first, nobody knew what was inside, but after everything they had already encountered, the locked freezer immediately became important. One possibility entered the officers' minds: what if Monique was inside? They didn't know yet. There was no confirmation, just a growing suspicion that something was very wrong. So they called a locksmith, and while they waited for him to arrive, the officers remained near the freezer. Then, something changed. They smelled something. It wasn't strong at first, but there was an unmistakable odor coming from somewhere inside. The officers became increasingly tense. One of them admitted that his heart was racing. Another clearly didn't want to see what was waiting inside. The locksmith was now the only thing standing between them and whatever was behind that lock. And suddenly, the officers weren't wondering where Monique had gone anymore.
They were wondering whether she had ever left the house at all. The locksmith arrived and began working on the freezer. By now, the officers had a growing suspicion about what they might find. But suspicion was one thing. Actually opening that freezer was something else entirely. The lock resisted, and as they waited, the smell coming from inside became harder to ignore. One officer caught another whiff. This time, there was no doubt. Something was decomposing inside. The tension in the room immediately changed. The officers knew there was a possibility they were about to find a body, but until that freezer was opened, they still couldn't know for certain. Then, the lock finally gave way. The freezer opened, and within seconds, the officers realized their worst suspicion had been correct. There was a person inside. It was Monique. The woman they had been searching for had never left the house. Her body had been stuffed inside the chest freezer. For the officers who had walked into the residence expecting to perform a welfare check, the discovery was devastating. What began as a missing person investigation had suddenly become a homicide scene. And outside the house, Daniel was no longer simply a suspicious man who couldn't explain where Monique had gone. He was now a murder suspect.
Daniel Rue and his wife Gina Lopez were immediately arrested. But even after police found Monique's body, Daniel still had an explanation. He claimed that he had found Monique unconscious inside the home. According to him, she was surrounded by drug paraphernalia. He said he panicked. He claimed he didn't know what else to do. And that was why, according to Daniel, he placed her body inside the freezer. If that was true, investigators would have to determine how Monique actually died, so her body was sent for an autopsy. And that's where Daniel's story faced its biggest problem yet, because what investigators found inside Monique's body was something that could not be explained away as a simple accident. She had an enormous amount of fentanyl in her system, more than 200 times the lethal dose. Suddenly, investigators weren't just asking how Monique had ended up inside the freezer. They were asking a much darker question: who had given her that much fentanyl, and why? The answer would lead investigators back to the people who had been living with Monique and to a conflict that had been building inside that house long before police ever arrived. Finding Monique's body answered one question: she hadn't left. But it created an even more important one. Why would anyone want her dead? Investigators began looking closely at the relationship between Monique, Daniel Rue, and Daniel's wife, Gina Lopez. The three had been living under the same roof for months. Daniel originally met Monique at a Home Depot. Eventually, she allowed him to stay with her in exchange for helping around the house. But what started as an arrangement that was supposed to benefit both sides gradually turned into a serious conflict. Problems began developing over the condition of the home. Monique reportedly became increasingly frustrated with Daniel and Gina over cleanliness and the way the house was being maintained. But that wasn't the only problem. Monique also suspected the couple of stealing from her. The tension between them continued to grow, and eventually Monique made a decision. She wanted Daniel and Gina out of her home. That decision would become one of the most important details in the entire investigation, because according to prosecutors, Daniel didn't simply disagree with Monique. He decided to eliminate the problem. Prosecutors alleged that Daniel administered a massive amount of fentanyl to Monique in an attempt to kill her. And if their theory was correct, the motive wasn't just anger. Daniel wanted control of the home. After Monique died, her body was hidden inside the freezer. Then Daniel stayed inside the residence and began creating a completely different explanation for what had happened. He told police Monique had left town. He insisted he was only house-sitting, and when officers arrived to check on her, he repeatedly tried to keep them from entering. But there was another person inside that house who knew more than she had initially revealed: Gina Lopez. As investigators continued questioning her, Gina eventually came forward. Her account helped police understand what had been happening between the couple and Monique before her death. The accusations, the arguments, the growing tension, and finally, Monique's decision to make them leave. Now investigators had a possible motive: a massive amount of fentanyl in Monique's body, and a body that Daniel tried to hide inside the freezer. The pieces were beginning to fit together. But there was still one thing investigators had to determine: what exactly happened to Monique before Daniel put her inside that freezer? And that question would ultimately become central to the case against him. By this point, investigators had a disturbing chain of evidence. Monique was dead. Her body had been hidden inside a freezer in her own home. Daniel had been living there despite no one at the community knowing he was supposed to be there. And when police arrived, his explanation for Monique's disappearance kept changing. Then, the autopsy revealed the most important piece of evidence yet. Monique had more than 200 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in her system. Daniel's claim that he had simply found her unconscious was now facing serious questions. Investigators learned that Monique had become suspicious of Daniel and Gina. She believed they were stealing from her. Arguments over cleanliness and the condition of the home had also intensified. Eventually, Monique wanted the couple out. According to prosecutors, Daniel responded by administering a massive amount of fentanyl in an attempt to kill her and take control of the home. After Monique died, her body was placed inside the chest freezer. Then, when police came looking for her, Daniel tried to convince police that she had simply left town. But the evidence inside the house told a completely different story. Gina Lopez eventually provided investigators with information about what had happened. She was later charged with residential burglary and drug possession. Daniel was indicted on multiple charges, including second-degree murder, abuse of an older or vulnerable person, and drug-related felonies. The case remains ongoing, and Daniel faces the possibility of a life sentence. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire case is what happened when police first arrived. They weren't looking for a murder suspect. They weren't investigating a homicide. They were simply trying to find a woman who hadn't been heard from in nearly 2 weeks. And standing at the front door was a man insisting that she had gone away. Her car was still outside. Her dogs were still inside. And the woman everyone was looking for was inside the house too, hidden in a locked freezer. Daniel had spent the entire encounter trying to convince police that there was nothing wrong, but every contradiction brought them closer to the truth. And eventually, they opened the one thing Daniel had hoped they would never look inside: the freezer. What began as a simple welfare check ended with a body, a homicide investigation, and a case that could put Daniel behind bars for the rest of his life. Because sometimes the biggest clue isn't the story someone tells police, it's the story their own house is telling.
And that's where this case stands today. But if you think this case was disturbing, wait until you see what happened in the next one. Subscribe to KEROLAD, because we've got more real cases coming that you definitely won't want to miss.